When Shannen Doherty passed away, the world mourned the loss of a beloved actress. But for the new owners of her Los Angeles home, her presence never truly left. The house, a beautiful, classic Hollywood Hills estate, had been her sanctuary for years. Tucked away behind tall hedges, it was an elegant yet eerie place, with sprawling rooms that seemed to whisper with memories of its past. The actress had always been deeply connected to it, often speaking of the strange feelings she experienced within its walls. After her passing, the property was sold to a young couple, Daniel and Claire Evans, who were unaware of the stories surrounding it. At first, the house welcomed them with open arms. They admired the vintage architecture, the sweeping staircases, and the peaceful garden where Shannen had spent many afternoons. But as the weeks passed, an unsettling presence made itself known. Claire was the first to sense it. She would wake in the middle of the night to soft murmurs echoing through the hallways, as if someone were having a distant conversation. At times, she swore she could hear the faint hum of a television turning on by itself, always playing old episodes of Charmed, though the couple didn't own any DVDs or subscriptions to streaming services carrying the show. Daniel was more skeptical. "It's just an old house," he told Claire. "Wood shifts, pipes creak. That's all." But then he saw her. One evening, while working late in the study, he glanced at the reflection in the window and nearly dropped his glass. A woman stood at the end of the hallway, her dark hair framing her pale face, her eyes locked onto his. She looked like Shannen Doherty, exactly like her. As he turned, she was gone. After that, things escalated. Lights flickered with no electrical explanation. Objects moved on their own. A book falling from the shelf, a chair scraping against the floor in the dead of night. But the most terrifying moment came when Claire was alone in the bedroom and the vanity mirror suddenly fogged up, as if someone were breathing onto it. Slowly, words appeared as if written by an unseen hand. "This is still my home." Terrified, the couple reached out to a paranormal investigator, who confirmed what they had begun to fear. Shannen Doherty's spirit had not left. Whether she remained out of love for her home or an unwillingness to let go of the life she had, they did not know. Eventually, Daniel and Claire made the difficult decision to sell the house. The new owners, whoever they would be, would have to share their home with the ghost of a Hollywood legend. And late at night, when the wind moves through the corridors and the shadows stretch across the walls, one might still hear a voice, soft, wistful, and unmistakably hers. The Evanses left in the late spring, their departure hurried, their belongings packed in disarray, as if the house itself had forced them out. No listing stayed up for long. Interested buyers would visit, admire the grandeur of the estate, and then leave with an uneasy expression, as though the air inside carried a weight they could not explain. For months, the house sat empty. The once manicured gardens grew untamed, vines creeping over the stone pathway leading to the grand entrance. The pool, once reflecting the golden California sun, became still and stagnant, the water darkening under the weight of neglect. Even the air around the property seemed heavier, quieter, as if the house held its breath, waiting. Then came the Montgomerys. Richard and Eleanor Montgomery were not the type to be frightened by stories. A middle-aged couple with backgrounds in academia, they prided themselves on their rationality. Richard was a historian specializing in American folklore, and Eleanor, a professor of psychology, had spent years studying belief systems and the power of suggestion. When they heard the rumors surrounding the house, they dismissed them as exaggerations, a classic case of a self-fulfilling prophecy. "People see what they expect to see," Eleanor had said confidently on their first tour of the house. And yet, as they stepped inside, something in her shifted. The air was thick, almost oppressive, carrying a scent that was neither pleasant nor foul but distinctly old, not the musty decay of an abandoned home, but something deeper, something lived in, as if the essence of past moments still clung to the walls. The furniture, though polished and staged for potential buyers, seemed untouched, as though it resisted the presence of new owners. The hardwood floors groaned beneath their feet, not with the casual protest of aging wood, but with a sound that felt intentional, as though the house itself was reacting to their arrival. Eleanor shook off the unease, attributing it to an overactive imagination. Richard, fascinated by the home's history, was eager to begin their new life there. "Think of the research we can do," he said, his eyes alight with excitement. "A documented haunting? A Hollywood legend lingering in her own home? This could be groundbreaking." They moved in on a crisp autumn afternoon, the sky washed in muted gold and violet, the first cool breeze of the season whispering through the trees. Boxes filled the hallways, suitcases stacked against the grand staircase. The house, for the first time in months, was alive again with voices and movement. For the first few nights, nothing happened. The Montgomerys settled into their routines. Eleanor set up her study in a sunlit corner of the library, while Richard spent his evenings poring over historical records, searching for any trace of past owners who might have contributed to the house's reputation. They entertained guests, laughed over glasses of wine, and made plans for renovations. But then, the presence began to stir. It started subtly. A door left ajar would be found shut. A draft would pass through a room with no open windows. The scent of lilac soft, fleeting would drift through the air with no discernible source. Eleanor noticed it first in the upstairs hallway, a faint fragrance that vanished the moment she tried to trace it. One night, as she sat reading in bed, a whisper brushed her ear. Not a word, not a phrase, just a breath of sound, so close and intimate that she felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She turned sharply, her pulse hammering, but there was nothing. Richard dismissed her concerns with a chuckle. "Your mind is playing tricks on you," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We wanted a haunted house, didn't we?" But then Richard saw her. It was past midnight, the house wrapped in a hush so deep it felt unnatural. He had been in the library, sifting through old property records, when a movement in the doorway caught his attention. He glanced up, expecting to see Eleanor, but the figure standing there was someone else. She was barely there, a silhouette of shifting darkness and pale light, her features blurred as though she were caught between the past and the present. Her hair framed her face in soft waves, and her eyes, deep, shadowed, held his with an intensity that sent ice through his veins. Shannen. Recognition hit him like a physical force, even though he had never met her. He had seen her in films, in interviews, in countless images frozen in time, but none of them captured the presence before him now. She was not a memory. She was not a trick of the mind. She was here, and then she was gone. A breath of air, a flicker of movement, a silence that stretched too long. Richard sat motionless, heart pounding, the room around him unchanged but undeniably different. The next morning he didn't mention it to Eleanor. Not yet. But as they sat at breakfast, a single sound echoed through the house. A whisper of laughter, distant, hollow, and the scent of lilacs filled the air. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The laughter faded as quickly as it had come, but the silence it left in its wake felt thick, pressing in on the Montgomerys like the air before a storm. Eleanor set her coffee cup down carefully, her fingers lingering on the porcelain as she turned her head, as if straining to hear something just beyond the reach of sound. Richard forced a chuckle, though it came out thin and unconvincing. "Old pipes," he muttered. "Or maybe the wind." Eleanor didn't respond. She simply stood, smoothing out the creases of her robe, and walked toward the hallway. She moved slowly, hesitantly, her bare feet making no sound against the polished wood. The house felt different today, charged, expectant, as if something within it had awoken. She stepped into the hallway leading to the grand staircase. Morning light filtered through the stained glass window at the landing, casting fractured colors across the walls and floor. The scent of lilacs still clung to the air, but there was something else now, a faint warmth, the ghost of perfume, as though someone had just walked past her. Then she saw it. On the mirror at the end of the hallway, a single word had appeared, traced in the condensation left behind from the night's lingering humidity. "Stay." Eleanor inhaled sharply, her pulse quickening. The word was written in smooth, deliberate strokes, as though a finger had glided over the surface with careful intent. She reached out, hesitating just before her fingertips met the glass. The air around it felt unnaturally cool. A shadow flickered behind her. She spun around, expecting to see Richard, but the hallway was empty. The stillness pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. The house was listening, watching. She backed away slowly, her own reflection staring at her with wide eyes, her breath coming shallow and fast. When she returned to the dining room, Richard was still at the table, his brows furrowed as he scrolled through old newspaper archives on his laptop. He didn't look up. "We need to talk," she said quietly. He exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "About what?" Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "I think she's still here." That got his attention. He glanced up, and for the first time in their marriage, she saw something like uncertainty in his expression. Not disbelief, not amusement, something closer to reluctance, as if he had been waiting for her to say it first. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Richard leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "I saw her." Eleanor stiffened. "When?" "Last night." His voice was measured, but she could hear the weight behind it, the way he was choosing his words carefully, as though he still wasn't ready to fully accept what had happened. "I was in the library." She was standing in the doorway. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "You're sure it was her?" Richard hesitated. "I don't know what else it could have been." They sat in silence, the house breathing around them. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the next room sounded unnaturally loud, each second stretching into the next. The walls seemed to close in, not in a physical sense, but in a way that made Eleanor feel like she was no longer alone in the room. Not truly. She glanced toward the hallway. The mirror. The message. "Stay." It hadn't been a warning. It hadn't been a threat. It had been a request. That night, the house was restless. The temperature fluctuated without explanation one moment. The air was thick and stifling, pressing against their skin like an unseen force, and the next, it was cold enough to make Eleanor shiver beneath the blankets. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked open on its own. Richard lay still beside her, his breathing shallow, his fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. She could tell he was awake. Neither of them spoke. And then the music started. A soft melody, distant and muffled, drifting through the air like a song playing from another time. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but as the seconds passed, it grew clearer. Eleanor sat up slowly, her breath caught in her throat. The sound was coming from downstairs. Richard turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. He heard it too. Without a word, they climbed out of bed. The floorboards felt cold beneath their feet as they moved toward the hallway. The music low, melancholic seemed to be emanating from the living room. It was a song Eleanor recognized, though she couldn't immediately name it. Something old, something familiar. They reached the staircase. The living room lay in darkness, but a faint glow flickered beyond the doorway, as if a candle had been lit. Richard swallowed. "We should." Then the music stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, thick and waiting. And then a whisper, low, feminine, close. "You're listening now." Eleanor felt her heart lurch into her throat. Richard grabbed her wrist instinctively, his grip tight, but she barely registered it. Because just beyond the doorway, in the dim glow of the moonlight spilling through the windows, she could see her. A figure, seated in the armchair by the fireplace. A woman, her face cast in shadow, but her presence undeniable. And when the faintest glimmer of light caught her features, Eleanor knew. Shannen Doherty was still in her home, and she had something to say. Eleanor's breath hitched, her chest tightening as though the air itself had thickened, pressing against her ribs. Richard's grip on her wrist was firm, but he did not pull her back. He too was staring, his breath coming in shallow, uneven draws. The figure in the armchair did not move, but she was there, not a trick of the light, not a fleeting shadow. She was there. The soft glow from the street lamps outside filtered through the sheer curtains, painting shifting patterns over the walls. It was enough to catch the edges of her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, the faint shimmer of fabric clinging to a form that seemed both tangible and impossibly fragile. She was not ghostly in the traditional sense. There was no flickering transparency, no unnatural glow. If anything, she looked present, as though she had simply always been there, waiting for them to finally notice. Eleanor swallowed, but the lump in her throat refused to move. Richard shifted, clearing his throat softly, and in that instant, Shannen lifted her head. The motion was smooth, deliberate, sending a cascade of dark waves over her shoulder. And then, she looked directly at them. Eleanor had expected something hollow, something vacant, the eyes of the dead, lost in some eternal void. But what she saw instead was something far worse. Shannen's gaze was full of awareness. It pinned Eleanor in place, sharp and searching, as though she were the intruder here, not the other way around. It was not hostile, nor was it welcoming. It was something else entirely. Something like recognition. For the longest time, no one moved. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, the stillness stretching impossibly thin, as though at any moment the world itself might crack beneath its weight. Then, Shannen's lips parted, and though her voice was only a whisper, it carried through the space like an echo from somewhere deep beneath the earth. "Why did you come?" Eleanor shivered, not from cold, but from the strange weight of the words. Not, "Why are you here?" but, "Why did you come?" As if this moment had been inevitable, as if they had been called. Richard exhaled slowly, his voice surprisingly steady when he answered. "We live here now." Shannen's expression didn't change. The silence swelled again, wrapping around them like an invisible current, deep and endless. Then her gaze flickered just for an instant toward the grand staircase. The motion was so small, so fleeting, that Eleanor almost thought she imagined it. But then, something creaked from above them. A single footstep. Eleanor's stomach twisted into a knot. She and Richard exchanged a glance, neither of them daring to say what they were both thinking. They had assumed, perhaps foolishly, that if Shannen was here, she was alone. But now, something shifted in the air, an almost imperceptible change in pressure, as if another presence had stirred awake. Shannen's lips parted again, but this time it was not to speak. It was to smile, a small, knowing smile, and then she was gone. No flicker, no slow fade into nothingness, just gone as though she had never been there at all. The chair sat empty, the air oddly warm where she had just been, and yet Eleanor swore she could still feel the weight of her stare lingering in the room. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then, Richard inhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I think," he said hoarsely, "we should leave." Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight to speak. But when she turned back toward the staircase, her body went cold. At the top of the landing, in the dimness of the hallway, stood a second figure. Tall, wrong. Where Shannen had been graceful, familiar, this thing was not. Its shape was human, but only just the limbs too long, the posture unnaturally stiff. Its head was tilted, as if studying them, and though it stood in darkness, Eleanor could feel its eyes. Watching, waiting. It had been here all along, and now it knew they had seen it. The house had always belonged to Shannen, but something else had been living in it too, and it had no intention of letting them go. Eleanor's breath came in short, sharp bursts, her body frozen, yet every instinct inside her screamed to run. She could feel Richard beside her, his muscles tensed, his breathing unsteady, and yet neither of them could move, held in place by something more than fear. The figure at the top of the staircase remained still, its form half swallowed by shadow, yet unmistakably present. The way it stood waiting made Eleanor's stomach twist. It was as though it had been there all along, lingering in the quiet spaces of the house, watching unseen. And then it took a step forward. The floorboard groaned under its weight, the sound low and stretching, as if the very wood resisted its presence. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. Move, move, but her body refused to obey. The air changed, thickened, darkened, as if the very fabric of reality had stretched just a little too far. A whisper, not a voice, not words, but a sound. Something too low and fragmented to decipher seeped into the air. The presence at the top of the stairs shifted again, its posture tilting, and in the dimness, Eleanor caught the faintest suggestion of a smile. Not Shannen's knowing, almost sorrowful smile. No, this one was different. This was something else. a shape that did not belong, a presence older than the house itself, something that had been waiting. Eleanor felt Richard's fingers tighten around her wrist, firm, desperate, pulling her back. Go. His voice was barely more than breath, but the urgency in it shattered the paralysis holding her in place. Eleanor turned, stumbling, her heartbeat crashing against her ribs, Richard's grip on her, the only thing keeping her upright. They didn't stop for shoes, for jackets, for anything. The grand front door stood just a few feet away, but the air around them thickened, slowed. It was like wading through water. The house did not want them to leave. Behind them, the figure moved again, a slow, deliberate descent, step by step, and then a sharp gust of lilac, strong, overwhelming, pushing through the thickened air like a breath of wind. Eleanor nearly collapsed with the force of it, her senses overwhelmed, but suddenly they could move again. A door slammed upstairs. The temperature dropped. A single whisper, right against Eleanor's ear. Go. Eleanor did not hesitate. She ran. The front door burst open under Richard's desperate shove, the night air slamming into them with the force of a wave. They stumbled onto the porch, their breaths sharp and ragged. Behind them, the house loomed silent, watchful. The light in the living room flickered once, then went dark. And in the upstairs window, just for an instant, Eleanor swore she saw her, Shannen, standing in the shadows watching them go. But she was not alone. Something else stood behind her. Something taller. Something that did not move like a person should. And just before Eleanor turned away, just before she forced herself to run down the driveway, her legs barely carrying her, she saw the darkness behind Shannen's shoulder shift. And then, she heard the door click shut. Soft, final, as if the house had decided. It had let them go. But it would not make that mistake again. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.